there are a number of very important outcomes to a functional behavior assessment. These are the things that we want to have once we've completed it. The first one is we want a clear description and definition of the problem behaviors. In other words, we want to know very clearly what the problems are and how are we going to measure them in a meaningful way. There's also this term, classes of behavior. A class of behavior is a group of behaviors, two or more behaviors that serve the same function. So if you can have a student who has 3 different problem behaviors, if all 3 of those behaviors happen for the same reason, that is one class of behaviors or one response class. When we develop interventions, we're going to develop them around classes of behavior and not individual behaviors. It makes it a lot easier to actually develop interventions, and it makes it more effective. The other thing that we want to identify are the things that happen before a behavior or events that might predict the occurrence or the non-occurrence of problem behaviors. Now, this confuses people sometimes. It's usually obvious to people why we want to identify things that predict the occurrence of a behavior. For example, if you see that a behavior usually happens when we give this student a task that involves a lot of writing, that is an important piece of information that we want to look at that can give us some clues into why the behavior occurs. However, it's just as important to know what are things that predict the non-occurrence of a problem behavior. If you've got some situations where the problem behavior almost never occurs, you can get a good sense as to why the behavior occurs. For example, if the person never has a problem at free time or transition time, yet has problems often during instructional times, right away you're going to suspect that the student may be engaging in these behaviors to escape some kind of task. You also, of course, have to look at the consequences of behavior, but the non-occurrence or situations where the student is not having a problem can be extremely useful, and it's often something that's overlooked. Another term that's important is setting events. The book explains this pretty well. So if you're confused, go back and reread that section. Setting events are things that may not happen right before the behavior occurs, but they influence the behavior. For example, if a student is not feeling well or sick and comes to school with a really bad headache, and then you come up and say, okay, we're going to have a spelling test today, get your paper out, and then the kid throws something at you and says, go to hell, leave me alone. Well, the antecedent of that verbal outburst was what? Well, the antecedent was the fact that you gave the student a demand. That was the antecedent. It happened just before the behavior. But, usually when you give the student a demand, nothing happens. So something else is going on, and it's probably the fact that this kid doesn't feel well today, so that demand you gave is more aversive, and the student is more motivated to escape it. So the reason the student's more motivated to escape it is because he's not feeling well. That is a setting event. So setting events are different from antecedents. Another kind of setting event might be, just to give you an example, one of my students years ago come into my classroom every morning, and I'd say good morning to him, and he would get right to work. He got in a fight with his brother on the way to school, and when I said good morning, he yelled at me, and that was something really just not typical of his behavior. I had a discussion with him, and I found out what had happened. So setting events can carry over problems from one setting into another, or one situation into another. So if a student has a difficult time in one class and then goes to a different class, the student may start out on the wrong foot. Those are called setting events. They're different from antecedents because an antecedent is what's going on at the moment. They're both important. The next outcome for a functional behavior assessment is identifying the reinforcers. What are the things that happen after a behavior that reinforce the behavior and they maintain the behavior? In other words, what is the student trying to get out of this behavior? Is the student engaging in this behavior because it leads to attention from the peers or attention from a teacher? Is the student engaging in the behavior because it leads to escape from something? What's the student trying to get out of it? We learn this by collecting information on what usually happens after the behavior occurs. You're not going to be able to learn a function just by watching a behavior for, a short period of time. This is because often when we engage in behaviors, we don't get reinforced, but we keep doing the behaviors. You do it because it works sometimes. So you have to see enough occurrences of a behavior to look for patterns. Just like with antecedents, you look for patterns and consequences. Private stimulation, or a person can engage in repetitive movements to get sensory stimulation, or a person can flick things in front of his or her eyes to get visual stimulation. These are sensory things the person is trying to obtain. So the person is trying to regulate his or her level of stimulation by engaging in some kind of behavior. And in this case, the person is trying to increase stimulation. You see that sometimes with kids with ADHD. If you put a kid with ADHD in a situation and you require her or him to sit and be passive for long periods of time, they're going to start moving around and fidgeting and doing all kinds of stuff. They're doing that to try to increase their level of stimulation. The other things that a person could be attempting to obtain are more things that are external. External things are often socially mediated. That means that another person is involved. Sometimes kids will engage in behavior to get attention. They want a reaction from someone else. So sometimes it's a reaction that we would think is a positive reaction. A kid might say something or do something just to get somebody to give them attention in a positive way. Often kids will do things to get negative attention. They may just do something to get someone to react in such a way that they're going to get a reprimand, or somebody's going to tell them to stop something. It's still attention, and a lot of kids don't care. It's one form of attention, they'll work for it just as much as another form. And some kids, there have been just a few, it's not real common, but I've known several kids that preferred negative attention to positive attention. One young man was in my wife's class for a number of years, and she could give him all kinds of praise, and he just really, if he would do anything just to get somebody to react negatively to him. So it made it really difficult to work with him. Sometimes kids will engage in behaviors to get something tangible, to get access to some activity or object that is something they want. So, reinforcement can be tangible. They want something somebody else has, or they want access to something, or sometimes they want to keep access to something. When we come to things the person wants to escape or avoid, just like things the person wants to obtain, those can be private or things that you can't see, or they can be things that you do see. The private events can be things like, anxiety, or if a person has too much stimulation. So in the previous example, we talked about kids with ADHD. Kids with autism often will be in a situation and they will try to reduce their level of stimulation. So it's almost the opposite of kids with ADHD sometimes. They may be overstimulated, so they may engage in some repetitive movement or repetitive vocalization to try to drown out some other kind of stimulation, or they may actually try to just escape the environment completely if it's too overstimulating for them. Often kids will do things to escape demands. That's very common in classroom settings. Kids will engage in different kinds of behaviors to have demands removed or to be removed from a situation. And sometimes kids will do things to escape attention or interaction with other people. And there are lots of other examples. These are just a few down here, but it gives you an idea of the kinds of things that you're looking at. However, it is helpful to first look at, is the kid trying to obtain something or trying to avoid something? Then you go down to more specifically exactly what is the student trying to obtain or what is the student trying to avoid through their behavior. And like the old saying goes, what's good for the goose isn't good for the gander. What we mean by that is, I probably do need to change this one. What works for one student may not work for another student. You have to look at the individual situation, you have to look at the individual needs of the student, and you have to look at the reason the behavior is occurring in the first place. Sometimes behavior serves multiple functions. In other words, you can have one behavior that could be a way the student gets attention, and the same behavior might be used sometimes to escape demand. So it just makes things a little more difficult sometimes. One of my first students, or first job I ever had, I worked with a young lady who was blind and deaf and nonverbal. She engaged in the behavior of arm biting. She would bite her arm, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out why she did it. I eventually came up with 3 different functions. She would do it for 3 different things.